And this is very special for us to be able to do this, in part because we were both journalists in our previous lives. And being at Facebook is a reunion of sorts. We covered the 2000 presidential campaign together. I was at NBC News. You were at the Boston Globe at the time.
I was.
And we met and became friends because we were assigned to sit together on the plane.
The girls' row.
I know. So anyway, just to have this experience of something that's focused on journalism is very cool. And I think you're going to enjoy the film. The film is awesome. We both got a chance to see it. It's coming out, I think, widely starting Friday. So you're going to be excited.
Yeah, and for me, it's very personal because I worked at the Washington Post, as some of you know, for almost a decade before joining Facebook. And I can tell you it's a really incredible rendition, and obviously Meryl Streep is awesome. But with that, enough of us.
Yes.
Let's introduce the group we have here today. We've got producer Amy Pascal. Let's give her a big round of applause.
We'll be here.
Next, we have producer Christy McCosco. Screenwriter Liz Hanna. And the star of the movie The Post, Meryl Streep.
Welcome, everybody.
Can we hear everyone on their microphones? We'll make sure they're on.
Thank you.
There we go. It's working. That's
off?
fantastic. Well, thank you. What an incredible group of women to have here at Facebook today. So as I said, I worked at the Washington Post for a very long time, after the time of the movie, of course. But even then, the Graham family was spoken of in reverent tones. Don Graham, who used to be on the Facebook board, Catherine Weymouth, who was the publisher for a time, were all very present figures, but we also really felt the legacy of Catherine Graham in the newsroom and tried to do her proud. I wanted to ask you, as you studied her, what differences did you think you saw in the fact that she was a woman? I mean, there's lots of news organizations that are family dynasties. What did it mean to have a woman at the head of this one?
Well, it was the only one that had ever been, I think. Mm-hmm. She was delivered into her position by virtue of the fact that she was an heiress. And her father bought the paper in the 30s and brought it up. And when he wanted to retire, he looked around for a successor and gave it to her husband. And she felt that that was appropriate because that's the way the world was then. It's really hard to remember. I mean, it's not hard for me to remember, but it's hard for you all who are so young to know how different the world was so very recently. I mean, recently to me. So when her husband then committed suicide, she was, the mantle of the Post was put on her shoulders, and she did not feel in any way up to that job. Even though she was one of the most brilliant, I mean, arguably brilliant women of the 20th century, she felt unable. And that feeling was delivered to her by everything in the culture, even though she was so well educated. She went to Vassar and then quit there because there were no boys and went to the University of Chicago and did very well. But she was raised to be a mother and a society matron. Am I taking up the whole time? Yeah. It's only the time.
Please
Nobody
do.
cares.
Yeah, keep going. Complaining
Keep
here.
going.
But the world was different. The time in which the week and a half that this movie takes place in was in 1971. That was the year I graduated from college. And there were very, very few women in law. There were a couple of people going into law school. But there were very few women in medicine. There were no women pretty much in business unless you were Estee Lauder or Helena Rubinstein and ran a makeup company. It was a really exclusionary world. There were no portals in except by someone's death and inheritance. and that's how she got to her position. So I remember that time, and I remember the limited opportunities for my class of graduating women, and yet it was exactly at that moment that everything was starting to break up and open up, and it was a seismically important time. And I had an earthquake last night.
That was Kay. That was Kay Graham.
Her.
She's
Yeah,
shaking
okay.
us, reminding us.
Yeah. Boom. Here we go again. So I feel like this movie's meeting its moment. You know, we're at a similarly interesting, ground-shaking moment in time.
Would you all talk a little bit, I mean, any or all of you, about like why this was appealing? Was it the journalism piece, the history piece, or the, her role, sort of her coming of age in coming into her own right? What made it appealing?
I mean, it all started with Kay herself. It started with her book, Personal History, which is...
It's an amazing book.
I think probably the best memoir I've ever read. That gets handed out at the Washington Post when you start there. Everyone has to read Mrs. Graham's book, which is amazing. But it started with this woman who had this amazing vulnerability talking about her life, and she never victimized herself. She never put herself in the position. She had many events in her life that she could have at any sort of point looked at and said, that was a tough time for me, and she never did that. She really took everything. She was very present, and she was very honest about looking back at her life and looking at her choices. And I read the book for the first time in my early 20s, and there was something very relatable and very sort of reassuring about this woman who, she wrote the book in her 80s, who was reflecting in this way that almost relieved the pressure of having to figure things out. At 22, you're scared and you make mistakes on an hourly basis, and having a woman sort of be like, that's okay, I did that. This was the mistake I made. This was the choice I made, was very reassuring and very refreshing. And so that's sort of where it started. And then this particular week, I think the reason that the movie is about that is because this was the moment that she found her voice. This was the moment that she came of age and became the woman she was going to be for the rest of her life. And there's something universal, I think, about seeing a story about a woman finding their voice, no matter what age they are.
Yeah. I was drawn to the relationship, the deep collegial working relationship between Ben Bradlee and Katharine Graham. And I thought it was incredible to see a respectful relationship in the workplace and in a movie. I mean, you don't see it every day.
The unromantic love story.
The unromantic love story between the two of them. And I was struck by that. And maybe it's because I've worked with Stephen for 20 years, and we have a respectful working relationship. And I just thought that the way that Meryl and Tom played their parts, they really showed us that the boss, Katharine Graham, could allow her coworker, but her underling, to feel like he was the boss at times and he could make decisions. And I love that.
In addition to being drawn to Katharine and relating to her more than I would like to admit, not the tall part, I think 1971 was a really important year in America. It was the year that all the best music came out. Sorry, guys. None of you were born, but it was the best. It was a year where the country was coming apart. It was Kent State and Attica, and everything was going on. And you had these incredible two people who were part of a Washington establishment who were only becoming cognizant in these moments that the whole world was about to erupt. And it was a time when, 2 minutes ago, when Kennedy was still alive, everybody believed in the government, and everybody loved the president, and nobody questioned it. And all of a sudden, with the Pentagon Papers, and then Vietnam, and then Watergate, our whole entire world and the way we feel about our country changed. And it started with this incredibly brave decision, first from the New York Times and then by Katharine Graham, to get sacrifice for the greater good. And that's a really hard thing to do, as we all know. And we all know everybody wants to be included. Everybody wants to be in the popular group. Everybody wants to be, in their case, invited to the White House. It was really hard for Daniel Ellsberg to decide that he was going to give up everything that he knew in order to get those papers published. I think it was hard for Robert McNamara to decide that someday people were going to know whether he thought it was going to be quite so soon or not. You know, that he was the one who commissioned these papers and wanted the world to know about Vietnam, and that he had actually changed his mind, and that was going to get revealed to the world, and he would forever be seen by some people as the actual war criminal. You know, obviously Neil Sheehan and what happened at the Times, and it was true for Ben Bradley, who had to face that half of his friends weren't going to be his friends anymore. That's a hard thing to do, but more than anyone, Catherine had to give up everything that potentially everything that she depended on, that she knew about herself, her fear of making a mistake, her fear of everybody being right, that a woman shouldn't run a company, knowing she would never get a second chance to do that, knowing that her company had just gone public. You guys know something about that. Knowing what that's like, and yet sacrificing her personal comfort for the greater good. It doesn't happen that much. And that's why.
Thank you. You talk about her vulnerability, and that comes through tremendously in the film. Talk a bit about her leadership style as a leader. What are there universalities in the way she led?
Well, she's very candid about this in her autobiography. She said she outlines where she made mistakes. She said in the beginning, like every good girl, she'd go around and try to convince everyone that her point of view was the right way to go. And if she got 5 people in a room and one was just holding out, she'd spend days going after him and trying to get him to change his mind. And she realized that, 4 out of 5 is good enough, and leave him to go sulk in the boys' room if he doesn't get his way.
Well, I mean, she was the boss,
and she was the boss.
It took her time to figure that out.
Exactly, it took her a long time to really accept that, and to accept being disliked. That's
key.
What was that?
That's key.
That is key. Yeah. Oh my God. In so many ways. Yes.
In so many ways. Yes. Yeah, that's a. As we all know, that's the biggest fear. You're going to make someone mad, make someone unhappy, make someone feel bad.
But I think what was interesting was that she maintained her empathy.
Yeah.
And she did not do that thing that people do when they get very powerful, which is cut off. And she kept that. It was important to her, and it was why people loved her at the Post. And even when they disagreed with her, even when people went on strike, they still respected her.
Yeah. And what always struck me as so interesting about her, they were also terrified of her. I mean, everybody called her Mrs. Graham. Like, barely.
They still do.
Called her Catherine.
The young reporters will, when they ask us questions, they'll say, "So when you were writing this about Mrs. Graham," and I'm like, "I call her Kay. Just like I never met her, so I'm gonna just be on a first name basis."
It's interesting that
you're a millennial.
That scared of someone.
If anyone wants to know what making this movie was like. Thank you, Christy.
I think women have a holistic approach to decision making that sometimes men don't take the time to have.
Ba-boom.
That's that earthquake.
Meryl, can I ask you a question about journalism? I lead the news partnerships team here, and we spend most of our time working with publishers trying to figure out what the future of journalism is going to look like, given this transition that we're going through. And in this role, you were deeply immersed in the journalism of a certain era, How do you compare it to what we see today among journalists? You've been outspoken in support of the Committee to Protect Journalism. I know it's important to you. It's such a different time, though. How do you think about it?
Well, definitely, we're in a big transition. It's news gathering by crowdsourcing, and there's an appetite and a demand for news right on the moment. If you talk to reporters at the Post and at the Times, people used to just go crazy trying to get everything exactly right before they'd put it out. But there's such a pressure to get news of the moment out and to try to verify it. Basically, people are going crazy. They're not sleeping. They're really not sleeping. This is a main problem.
That's a big issue.
It is a big issue. How do you share time? Maybe it's not something that we're going to have to share bylines or share. People are going to have to sleep, and I'm just thinking as a mother, really. But there's never been a better time to be a journalist. I was talking to the Dean Cole at Columbia School of Journalism, and he said, they're pressing at the gates, and all the J schools around the country, people just want to do this because they feel a mission and they feel important, and they know they're young and they want their lives to count, and this is the place now to do it. What do you think?
I think that there is there was something happened in sort of the last 10 years, which was we got a little complacent of getting into it. And there has been a sort of remarkable thing that's happened over the past year where people have stopped sleeping and stopped not asking questions. There are just more and more questions to ask. There are more and more answers to find out, and there should be more and more questions to ask. And I think sort of the remarkable thing that we've seen of the last year is that, and it's really, for me, the thing that is tied to 1971 is that there was the crack in the facade, and that we had to look behind it and see what was there, and we had to ask those questions. And I think there are an amazing amount of brave journalists now who are willing to ask those questions and willing to not sleep and willing to sacrifice their families and their lives and do that. And unfortunately, we have to keep asking them to.
I think the biggest question for journalism now has to do with nothing to do with the journalists. It has to do with the platforms that allow things. It's with Facebook and Twitter's and Google's responsibility to say a lie travels the world before truth puts his boots on or his pants on, depending who you're talking to. But that's the biggest question for our time is where do you stand? Where do you plant your feet? And where do you say, I'm going to make a stand? Because it's up to each individual person who puts out and is complicit and who enables mass tomfoolery. What's the word? I'm thinking of Tom Hanks. I don't know why.
Wow.
But mass manipulation of fact. And somehow we have to know that the ground we're standing on, that there is such a thing, that there is such a thing as the truth. And here's where it is.
The North Star is north.
The North Star is north. Yeah. That's the sun. It's not the moon. That's Petruchio in Taming of the Shrew.
Yeah.
That is the sun if I say it is. And he's pointing at the moon. And this is an old gambit, and it's the gambit of ideologues. And so we're all in it together. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
We're all in it together.
I think my greatest fear would be that there used to be something that maybe was closer to the truth, or maybe it wasn't, but it was national and it was global, and people didn't have their own news, and people actually had to hear what other people were thinking, and that somebody was helping us make sense of what was happening in the world. It wasn't just you listened to who you agreed with and read who you agreed with. And I think that's something we all have to be really careful about, I think the Post and the Times are doing a good job of that now, and making sure that being sensitive to all sides getting covered, are trying to be. I think that is a threat for all of us.
I think the thing that I just wanted to say is that we all have to decide what the line is. There is a moral and ethical line that can't be crossed. And we all have that in ourselves. Nobody else can tell you what that is. And that's what we all have to be in together, is sort of coming together and deciding, okay, we've crossed it. We're too far. So I think that's what scares me, is when is too far? When does that line just get pushed? And then it's the horizon. Who decides that?
And that's something I know everyone in this room has thought a lot about over the last year in particular. We got some questions from our employees. This is from Facebook employee Kristen Murdoch. She writes, "This past year, we saw women come together in the most remarkable ways, from publicly condemning inappropriate behavior to sparking political and social movements. In many industries, women found the ability to speak truth to power, often leaning on each other for support. Are there women in your lives who you look to for mentorship, either personal or professional? And what are you doing to actively mentor other women?"
These women on the for me, these women on the stage, and my mother. The collection of women that made this film, for me, as this was my first film that was made, I keep joking that they broke me because now my standard is far too high. But it's true in a lot of ways of the mentorship of the women that happened on this stage and the women that were behind the scenes. Anne Roth, who I just hope to be when I grow up, and everyone.
She's our costume designer. She's 80s. Well, I'm going to say 6 because she lied.
She's also this big. She's this big, and then when she was done dressing everyone in the film, she started dressing the rest of us because we were not living up to the standard of what was supposed to be there.
And Steven Spielberg.
Yeah. Steven started referring to her as his co-director at times because you don't want to cross Anne Roth. But that's for me. These women.
Oh, I feel like I have always made chick flicks. And always wanted to tell stories about women, because I am a woman and I understand women better, and understand, the world. I think that one of the great things that happened this year, in addition to women coming together in all sorts of great ways, was that the biggest movies of the year were Beauty and the Beast and Star Wars and Wonder Woman. I think that's pretty awesome. Because that means that everybody, boys and girls, went to go see movies about women, and they didn't make a distinction between them. And I think that's a really important, big, giant change.
I'm going to get one more question in from, or maybe we may have time for 2 more, from one of our employees. This is from Kelsey Sanchez, and it's for you, Meryl, what are some of the specific challenges that you have faced in your career as a woman?
Well, I have to say my mentors, going back to the other question, were mentors. And I'm really, really grateful to them. I had some amazing, my high school teacher was a woman, and I think well, I won't say that.
Go ahead.
But she was fantastic. Music teacher. I thought she was so old. I found out she was 24 at the time.
You are never allowed to call me young ever again.
Yeah. But Joseph Papp at the Public Theater picked me up, from a train. I came in on a train and auditioned, and he sort of launched my entire career in the New York Theater. And then certainly Mike Nichols was a great mentor. And we rely really on the men to help us up. I mean, you got to have somebody open the door, especially if that door is closed except for 1 woman or 2 women and 9 or 8 or 12 men. The door really needs to be opened, and know that it doesn't mean somebody's getting kicked out. Somebody's going to lose their job if you let a woman in. I've been really, really grateful and lucky. That's my mentor story. But what was the other part of your question?
Challenges that you
Challenges.
have faced
Challenges.
as a woman, and I think because you're
Biggest challenge is being a mother. Biggest challenge is trying to have a big career and have, well, I had so many children. I had 3 daughters. Oh my God. And they're my joy. But it's very hard to do. And so flexibility in the workplace is really, really important. And it's going to be part of a thing that will change, I think, in this little moment we're facing right now. Because I think men want it too. I think men want to be with their families and to have that flexibility. And now you can take your work home. Things are, it's a little bit easier. So, yeah.
This is another question from Aurelie Flores on Facebook. In the post, we see Mrs. Graham working in a field that is very competitive and male-dominant. What advice would you give to someone who is also pursuing a career that is just as competitive and highly male-populated?
I'm going to give that to Amy, because Amy Pascal entered the highest echelons of Hollywood. She ran a studio in the days when no women did. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
and you were one of the pioneers, absolutely pioneers. She was. And you're the
She
reason-
adjusted her seat. She's ready now.
No, I'm saying you gave me so many jobs, and jobs in movies that no man wanted to see. Julie and Julia. I'm sorry, about cooking and Fat Woman. You gave Nora Ephron so many jobs, my friend, and that counts. Right. Because you're coming up against people in the boardroom and go, I don't know. Go ahead, but here's $9 million to do it or something.
Yeah, right. I think that the best advice anyone ever gave me was don't try to act like anybody else. Don't compete with anybody else, ever. And you'll end up in a class by yourself. And I was in a class by myself a lot. But I never competed with men to act like a man. I never tried to out-guy anybody. And I think that is some advice I would give women and men, really, to trust your own instincts, because they're the only ones that you have. And if you lose them, you start trying to do what other people are doing or try to understand what you think people are going to like beside what you like, you're fucked.
Jesus, Amy.
Right?
At least I didn't say it. So, yeah.
And I think that's true. And I think be understanding that people are afraid. I think that is another thing I would say.
Oh, that's it.
Because they are afraid. They're afraid of you. They're afraid of the way that you are. They're afraid of what you want and feel. They don't understand you. And nobody told them how to like you or be with you. And you have to be compassionate about that and smarter and rise above it, be okay with it. Mm-hmm. Just keep moving. Mm-hmm.
Really wonderful. Thank you. Anything else? You have any other advice? You have any advice you want to top that?
Well, see, the thing about show business is there's always a lot of girls. I mean, they need them, in the movies. You have to have maybe one or two. And so I haven't worked in an all-male-dominated job. I'm trying to think back to other jobs I've had. I had a job on a loading platform, loading 50-pound bags of modeling clay.
This is the next movie.
I learned the importance of upper body strength, but that sort of isn't so necessary now, I just was raised with brothers, and, you shouldn't be afraid to roughhouse, because that's fun. And I think that's part of the, sometimes I think there's a timidity built into women and girls that, or at least of my generation. I see it much less in my own kids, and I think they're much more out front and demanding and saying what they want, and being willing to plant their feet and say, no, I think this is a good idea, here's why, and not to be intimidated. But yeah, I wouldn't know what to say in a group of men who felt superior. That must be really, really tough. And I think it pervades, and I don't think it's just old men.
Well, I'm betting you would know, but thank you. This is a great place to end. Thank you all so much for being here today. I want to thank, before we forget, 20th Century Fox and Participant Media, who put out this incredible film, and for the work that Participant in particular is doing to shine a light on leading women through its content and social impact campaigns. #LeadingWomen is something you all should check out. We're going to close out today with an exclusive behind-the-scenes sneak peek of the film with the women who made it. And don't forget, one more important note, The Post is in theaters everywhere starting January 12th. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Jamaica. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was great.